Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to go to the Arctic. Thank goodness I don't actually have to go to the Arctic, but I am going to go vicariously through the adventures of three of my friends. Friends who know and think a lot about the Arctic. And you know what? I used to, for 40 years, believe that nuclear war was the biggest threat facing humankind, the most dangerous thing that we have to deal with. And I have changed my mind. I think the worst thing that we have to deal with now are clathrates at the bottom of the East Siberian Sea. If you haven't heard about that, I'm going to introduce you to Peter Wadhams, who is the guy who brought me to that conclusion. I don't know whether he intended to do so, and I don't know whether to thank him or blame him for it, but at any rate, that's what he's done to me. The other guy who knows a lot about climate is Paul Beckwith. And these guys all know each other. Franklin Griffiths is a retired professor of peace studies and political science at the University of Toronto. And he shared an office, I think, with the Wadhams at Oxford or Cambridge or something. Cambridge. So they know each other that way. And the only person who hasn't known them well yet is Doug Saunders, whom I do know. And he is a Global Mail international affairs man. And he loves to sit in on these, what I call schmooze days, because on a schmooze day, I don't have an agenda. I let the guests on these shows decide what they want to talk about, but I bet I know what they're going to talk about today. So, hello, folks. Good to see you all. Peter, I want you to start things off. Either you apologize to me for scaring the daylights out of me, or I'm going to thank you for bringing it to my attention. I haven't decided which yet.
Oh, well, you mean the threat that will all be annihilated by methane? Yes, I think it's a real danger, a real threat, and was never taken seriously enough. And so I wrote a book about the loss of ice from the Arctic, called Farewell to Ice, and a lot of my motivation for writing that, or some of it, was the fact that the threat of Arctic methane leaking, coming out in large quantities from the Arctic Ocean, and giving you a big methane jump that would cause a jump in global warming. That was something was being discounted, in fact, ridiculed. And having received quite a lot of ridicule and having had one of my articles actually censored on this, that is, the British government, weirdly, got me to go to China for a conference with the Chinese Academy of Sciences and to speak about the methane danger, because they were working on trying to quantize the threat to the world from different forms of climate emergency. And so they thought that this methane is a good case where it's not being properly considered. So I gave a talk and I wrote it all up, and the Foreign Office in the UK published a book with everybody's papers in except mine. And I didn't notice at first, and they didn't tell me. So I eventually said to them, "Hey, why did you leave that out?" And they said, "Well, we had sort of 4 editors for the proceedings, and one of them was a Harvard professor who said that he wouldn't, under any circumstances, have a paper on methane emissions in any book that he was running. And it was because the discoveries had been made by Russians, and especially in expeditions led by a woman. This is Natalia Shakova. So 2 counts against them for it must be fraudulent because it was Russians and it was a woman. And so I got my paper wiped out. So I thought, well, to hell with this. I'll make it one of the chapters in a book. And so that was an early encounter with some kind of prejudice against methane. And I guess probably Paul will find say the same thing. There's some bizarre thing going on with methane in the world that people don't want to write about it or write about the threat that it poses. But I don't know why. The story really about the methane in the Arctic is that you have very thick sediments under the continental shelves of the Arctic. And the continental shelves are very wide, about a third of the area of the Arctic Ocean, and with shallow water, with thick sediment underneath, which is methane which reacted with water ice to form a kind of solid called methane hydrates. So you have these thick layers of methane hydrate, and the reason they don't disintegrate and produce methane at a huge rate is because there's a layer of permafrost on top, which dates right back to before the last ice age, where the permafrost protects the methane from being emitted. If you release the pressure on methane hydrates, they turn back into methane, and the methane gas comes out. So this layer of permafrost is very vital. But what's happened recently is that with the sea ice retreating in summer and the water warming up, you can get several degrees of warmth in the coastal seas of the Arctic now. That means that the seabed warms up as well, and that means that the permafrost layer starts to thaw, and that gives you the danger that underneath that, all of this methane hydrates will just turn themselves back into methane and come out in a great big burst.
Okay, now yesterday I had exactly the kind of encounter that you sort of alluded to, which is that a friend of mine, a physics professor and a knowledgeable man, when told that I was going to be interviewing you about this, said something like, well, we don't really know. We know that it's warming up there, of course, but then unless there are actual numbers for how much methane is in the atmosphere in that area and how much the temperature has changed, it's a useless speculation. So I told him I would try to get some numbers. Do you have any numbers? Because I think he may be in exactly the kind of denial that you're talking about.
Well, he may be one of the guys who said I was an alarmist, which is
probably.
Well, as a famous American politician didn't say, alarmism in the cause of survival is no vice. And I think that there is quite a significant possibility that this could happen within a very few years, or straight away. And this is enough that we should be taking action. We should be taking preventive action, trying to find out how we could get rid of a massive amount of methane, and be ready for it, even though perhaps the probability that it'll happen is less than 50%, maybe 20 or 30%, but that's still, in global terms, it's certainly much more probable that we'll be inundated by a methane outbreak than that will be hit by an asteroid or some of these other.
And a methane outbreak being like an explosion or something, a very quick thing.
Well, not an explosion, although explosions are happening on land in the Arctic, where methane contained in chambers, underground chambers, explodes and produces these great big craters. But on land, it would be simply a lot of plumes of methane gas coming out of the seabed. They're already doing this, and there's a greater quantity of them each year. And the gas gets into the atmosphere because there's only maybe 100 meters of water depth, and the methane coming out of the seabed can't actually dissolve in the water in that length of time. You need methane does dissolve in seawater, but it takes longer. So methane that's released from deep seas never gets to the surface. The methane released from shallow waters like this does get to the surface, comes out into the atmosphere, and gives you a sudden methane burst, which will increase global warming. We calculated from data that the Russians gave us that you will get a warming of about a degree if significant amounts of this methane come out. And actually later people who've modelled this get higher values. So it's getting up from drifting up from 1 to 2 degrees. And that's in a sudden burst globally is dramatic. I think it would be dramatic for our survival and for the state of the planet.
Okay. Paul, what do you think about all that? I'm going to step back and let you guys have at it.
Sorry, did you say Paul or?
Yeah, I said Paul.
Yeah.
Paul,
Oh, okay. Yeah. First of all, you said 3 of your friends were here, and there's 4 of us on the 4 of us all together.
It was Doug that I accepted because I said all 3 of you know each other, and Doug doesn't know you yet, but he will by the time we're through.
Okay. Yeah. So what Peter is talking about, of course, is a huge concern. People need to remember that about 21,000 years ago, during the peak of the last ice age, the global sea levels were 130 meters lower than they are today. So those continental shelves, which cover about 1/3 of the area of the Arctic, the water depth is only 50 to 100 meters. They're very shallow. So that was exposed land before. And of course, there was a lot of organic matter which was frozen onto the ground. And this is the permafrost. And that of course, as the sea levels rose, when the ice was melting, that was all inundated. And, that's been under this water column of 50 to 100 meters. And when methane's coming out slowly, it can be taken up into the water. It can be dissolved in the water column. But when you get large releases of methane, then it completely saturates the ability of the water in the column above it to absorb any of the methane. So most of the methane gets up into the atmosphere. So that's the biggest concern. And of course, Peter did a paper with, I think it was Gail Whiteman a number of years ago, an economist, and they looked at the effects of a 50 gigaton burst of methane, either being released, in 1 year or being released, sort of over 10 years. And they found the enormous, effects to society. And of course, you'd get tremendous local warming in the Arctic over that region. It takes time for the methane to dissipate to lower latitudes. And already, as the risks, of course, are greatly increasing as we continue to lose Arctic sea ice. So the Arctic sea ice, if you look at the latest peer-reviewed science and modeling on when the Arctic sea ice will go, I don't think there's any disagreement that it's on its way out. One September in the near future. Well, we could argue what near means. Is it 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? And the numbers seem to be getting converging to closer values closer to the present. So, it used to be that the people thought the Arctic sea ice would first go out in the summer in 2100, and then it became 2070 and 2050, and I've seen 2030 in the literature. So, it could be, we just don't know the exact year, but the trend is all that we lose Arctic sea ice. So that will happen in 1 September. And likely I call it the blue ocean event. There won't be any Arctic sea ice, maybe a little bit around the edges is what people thought, so-called fast ice, but I think that's completely wrong because the edges, of course, are much lower latitudes. I think when the sea ice goes, the last little bit will be sort of floating around the North Pole, as opposed to, there won't be any fast ice. It won't be any sea ice that's connected to the land because those latitudes are much lower. And that's where we're getting the most warming, if you just look at last month, for example, if you look at April of 2021, the average temperatures in the Arctic for the entire month were 3 to 4 degrees Celsius above normal temperatures. So those sort of numbers, how can ice survive up there? So the biggest effect that we see from loss of sea ice is the overall Arctic being much, much warmer than it used to be. That lowers the temperature difference to the equator, and it's that temperature gradient to lower latitudes that determines the jet behavior of the jet streams, how the jet streams circumvent the Earth and the waviness of the jet streams. And, that is crucial to extreme weather events. So as the Arctic continues to warm at much greater rates than the rest of the planet, and I'm talking about, most articles up to a few years ago said the Arctic was warming at twice the rate relative to the average, but now you see them saying 3 times or 4 times, and it all depends on the latitude. If you go to the high Arctic, it's more like 8 times faster warming than lower latitude. So all of that warming lowers the contrast, the change relative to the lower latitudes, and that temperature change causes pressure changes, which then is the reason why the jet stream exists in the first place, because of that temperature differential. So the jet stream is slowing down and becoming much wavier and becoming stuck in place. And it actually acts kind of like a wall between the cold, dry Arctic air and the warmer, humid air from lower latitudes. So when it becomes very wavy in the north-south direction, we get stuck weather patterns. Meteorologists call it blocking patterns, and we get extreme weather events, like increases in the frequency, severity, duration of extreme weather events, like tropical rains leading to floods, tropical-like rainfalls, enormous rainfall events leading to floods, and droughts in other places. And I think my biggest concern from these extreme weather events, and of course these are going to worsen as the Arctic sea ice continues to decrease, and it's not just the sea ice, that's only half the effect. The other effect is the snow cover on the land, especially in the spring, because we're losing there's much less snow cover in the Arctic on land regions in the spring, and that covers an enormous area. So the Arctic is becoming literally a darker place. There's less ice and snow, and it's darker, so it's absorbing more solar radiation. So it's this albedo feedback which is causing the great warming. So my biggest concern is the progression of the Arctic sea ice. So if we lose it, say in 5 years in September, it'll be gone for maybe a couple of weeks to a month. And then within what really it gets affected is that the sea ice formation in the winter is greatly reduced. That's the biggest effect, actually. So within a few years after that first blue ocean event, where there's no sea ice in the Arctic in September, that will extend to no sea ice in August, September, and October, probably within about 3 years of the first event. And then within about a decade, I see no Arctic sea ice year round in the Arctic. And of course, at that point, we're in a much different planet, a much different situation, because the sea ice keeps the Arctic cool. The ice up in the Arctic keeps it cool. It takes a lot of energy to melt that ice, but the temperature is maintained at the freezing point. And remove that ice, and you have the water just warms. And if you have a kilogram of ice and you melt it, the energy to melt that kilogram of ice would raise the temperature of that kilogram of water to 70 degrees Celsius. So the latent heat effect, it's enormous amounts of energy to get the phase change from the ice, the solid to liquid water. And then once that is gone, then the temperature can skyrocket in the Arctic. And then watch out for the methane and all these other knock-on effects.
Now, wait a minute. You put the methane toward the end.
Yeah.
I think Peter's putting the methane at the beginning, aren't you, Peter?
Yes.
Early, like right away.
Only because you asked me to.
Yeah.
It's one of many really frightening effects.
Yes.
And Paul's been talking about the others.
And I think, I think the biggest consequences to humanity is our global food supply. Okay, our global food supply is threatened by abrupt climate change. And the recent papers are very concerning because they talk about the terrestrial carbon sink of vegetation on land. And that's expected to flip over from being a sink of carbon to a source of carbon with business as usual in 2 decades, 20 years. So when we, the yields will plummet of crops. Photosynthesis has trouble when the temperature is too warm. Plants can no longer, efficiency of photosynthesis reduces. Warmer world is not a good situation to be in, and our global food supply will be threatened. And I fully expect that we will have global famine within about a decade or so. like there'll be food shortages globally, and it'll cause a global famine. And this is we're looking at this within a decade or so, especially if the Arctic loses its sea ice and if methane is already starting to come out. If you look at the methane curve, it goes up and down cycles throughout the year, like the CO2 curve. And for some reason right now, the methane curve, it went through half of the cycle and then it jumped up in the Arctic. Okay, this is just happening. If you look at the methane data from NOAA or anywhere else in the last few months, so what's happening? Is this a glitch? Is this, we're seeing spikes of methane from time to time. If you look at the raw daily data, if you don't average it out, we're seeing some big spikes of methane, and it's not clear where that's coming from. I mean, we know that it's risen recently because of fracking, which is natural gas, more natural gas is being released from fracking into the atmosphere. We know that the wetlands, a lot of it is from wetlands, and we're getting more and more wetlands appearing in the north where they weren't before, because as the north warms, a lot of the permafrost, becomes inundated and it becomes more like marshland. And there's, we're also the tropics, things are happening in the tropics, which are very strange. And parts of the tropics will actually become uninhabitable very soon because people just won't be able to survive outside. It's too humid. It surpasses the wet bulb temperature, the heat and humidity combination. So we're in a climate emergency, and it's people haven't reacted at all. And in fact, I was hopeful with the COVID pandemic that money would be poured into the right industries like renewables, but instead of that, the fossil fuel industry got 97% of the COVID relief money that went to energy. Once again, so it just didn't happen. We haven't learned a thing, and we're all going to suffer the consequences very, very soon. I mean, it's happening already. More and more people are being displaced around the world. Climate change generates poverty. Look at these massive storms like Sandy and Harvey. They destroy people's homes, and insurance is only about 10% of the structures are covered by insurance. So people are driven into poverty. So
what should we do about it then, in your opinion, Paul?
We need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere ocean system.
Yes.
I mean, the fossil fuel industry has dug it out of the ground, and we've put it into the atmosphere ocean system, and we need to put it back we need to capture CO2 and remove it from the atmosphere ocean system. And there's lots of different ideas. Do we lime the oceans? Do we stimulate phytoplankton in the oceans? I think the oceans are the key. I think it's a lot easier to take CO2 out of seawater than it is out of the air. And we also need to seriously, I think we need to deploy solar radiation management technologies. There's some ideas on that.
How are these kinds of things to be done rapidly? Actually, we've got a time problem here, do we not? And
well,
we're losing time rapidly.
Yeah.
You've listed a lot of stuff already. We're in no way coping, it seems to me, adequately. Mm-hmm. Furthermore, I'd say there's a lack of scientific consensus on the rapidity and the scale of the problem we are talking about now. I think there's a need for science to get together in a way it is not, quite apart from everybody else.
Just one of the problems with scientists is that they, on the whole, apart from ones who really feel and recognize the importance of what's going on, is that they're very, very reticent. They don't want to make a fuss. They don't want to also to lose their promotion prospects in whatever institution they're in. So you can't rely on scientists for raising the alarm, although you ought to be able to. And Greta Thunberg keeps saying, follow the scientists and follow what they say. But I think that's quite dangerous because they often won't say enough. They'll just treat this problem, which is dire, as something that we can write a few papers on and get promotion to full professor and so on, and forget the fact that this is the life and death or death of the human race that we're talking about. So that you're right in saying science has let us down, and we've got to be more sort of activist in getting something done. One thing that's important that Paul's brought out in what he's been saying is the urgency of what's going on. Everything's happening much faster than anybody thought. When I started out doing Arctic research back in the previous millennium, everybody thought, well, if we study everything that we to know about sea ice and land ice and oceans in the Arctic, and then we'll know what the Arctic's like forever. But before we'd even discovered everything about it, it started to change really, and it's accelerated. Its change has accelerated, and we now know really that it's the Arctic that's the key to some of the biggest disastrous changes that are going on the whole planet. I mean, another one which Paul hasn't mentioned yet, but I'm sure he will, is the fact that as the climate warms or as the summer warms, when the ice disappears in the Arctic, you get warmer air passing over the Greenland ice sheet, and that's causing the Greenland ice sheet to lose more and more mass every summer. And instead of having no melt at all, which is what used to happen, you now have about 300 cubic kilometers melting out. And I remember standing on the ice sheet last August the 1st, when we had the biggest one day's melt ever recorded. And that melt is of course directly causing global sea level rise. It's now becoming about the biggest factor in global sea level. So as well as all the other awful things which we're doing to the planet via the Arctic changes, we've got this other one, which is that we're causing the planet to flood, and that's not going to reverse itself. We're going to have to cope with having accelerating rise in sea level, accelerating loss of coastal cities and coastal farming land. So it's it is a major issue. So the Arctic is really the key to the disastrous changes that are happening, and we have to see if we can find a way to slow that down. I personally, I'm not sure whether I can think of such a way, but
well, try, Peter. Think.
Well, just a few suggestions to start off with. Firstly, I agree with Paul. You've got to reduce carbon emissions down to some very low level, but by itself, that's not enough. Because carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere pretty much forever, if you emit it at all, you're warming the climate, and the Earth is getting warmer, and it's not going to get any cooler. So you won't save the world by reducing your emissions to zero, no matter what the UN says. You will only save the world by taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and bringing the greenhouse effect down to a lower level. And you can either take it out of the air by air capture, or you can take it out of the ocean. But you have to do one or the other, or both, if you're going to bring the climate under control. And so that's one thing you can do. That there are other things which people have talked about, which are, can we refreeze the Arctic? Can we save the sea ice, because it causes so many terrible things if the sea ice goes? Why can't we find a way to keep the sea ice? And that will then mitigate all of these effects. The only trouble being, how do you save the sea ice without cooling the climate of the planet as a whole? And I think that's the difficult one. How do we do that just by itself? Get rid of the sea, bring the sea ice back, but don't do the bigger job of cooling the entire planet. So maybe Paul's got some ideas on that, because there are various ideas around about how we might be able to cool the Arctic by itself, and that's one of the big issues that a foundation in Britain, that's David King's foundation, is working on, it's us taking that problem out and saying, we've got to reduce emissions, we've got to get rid of CO2, but we've got to save the Arctic sea ice, making that one of three aims that we should be going for.
What level of infrastructure would this entail to remove enough CO2 from the ocean or the atmosphere to, let's say, to prevent a 3-degree warming even, or something like that? Do we have any estimate of that? I know I think it was the journal Science, Nature a few years ago that published a useful year-by-year policy guide to what would need to be done over the next 40 years to prevent and eventually reverse the rise. And most of it sounded politically feasible, assuming the two largest economies bought into it. But a lot of it also weighed on carbon capture, as you know. It sounded like none of it, even if we switched all vehicles to electric in the next 10 years and all that. And I don't have a sense of this. Are we talking about building enormous devices in the middle of the ocean? What would it look like? What would it cost?
Well, you can already see some of those devices in pilot plants in action. The huge fans pumping air through systems that remove carbon dioxide, and then you do something with the carbon dioxide, either pump it underground or turn it into something useful like limestone. So it can be done, and the technology's there. It's the cost is the first thing, and the energy need, which people are realizing more and more that this not only will cost quite a lot, but we'll need to use energy to bring it about. And we mustn't use fossil fuel energy, obviously. So we rely on renewable energy. We have to go to places where there's a lot of it available, like geothermal energy in Iceland and so on. So
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea of using a machine with a big fan, I think that's that's not the way to go at all. I think we need to assist the natural ecological and biological systems on the planet to have them to enhance their ability to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. Small amounts in each location, would amount to a large amount globally. So I'm talking about, I think that the most promising, in my view, ways to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere quickly is to stimulate is iron in the ocean, iron seeding in the ocean to stimulate phytoplankton blooms. Now, people say, well, when you get a phytoplankton bloom, the phytoplankton then die and sink to the bottom and decompose and create oxygen dead zones and so on. That's only in shallow water. Okay, I'm talking about you stimulate phytoplankton blooms in the open ocean where the seafloor is, a couple 10,000 meters below or whatever, 10,000 feet below. 10,000 meters is tough. The Mariana Trench is the only place, but you do it in deep water, and then the phytoplankton remove large amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere, and then they sink downwards. They're ingested. It stimulates the entire trophic levels of the food chain, the marine food chain. And you can also you don't do it sort of like a monoculture sort of thing. You have, maybe I could see permanent, floating platforms in the open ocean with chains going down. So you stimulate the phytoplankton, and then the zooplankton go there, and you get kelp growing anchored off chains, like platforms deep, under the water that are suspended by chains. You get the shellfish, and you get a whole ecosystem in an area of the ocean where there was no life before. Very little life because because of the lack of nutrients and the lack of the phytoplankton at the base of the food chain. Like if you go to if the water is too warm, you get very little life in the ocean. It's almost like an ocean desert. If you look at the Caribbean, for example, the water, that blue water color, that means that there's almost no phytoplankton in that water, and the water is just too warm for that. So, and there's also some interesting ideas. There's an interesting idea by a group that is looking at MEER, MEER, they call it. And their thoughts are, you put mirrors on the surface of the earth and the ocean, and on land to cool the surface, reflect some sunlight back into space. But I don't think that's really that feasible, because you'd forever be cleaning those mirrors. I'm beginning to get more hopeful in the idea of putting something up in space to cut back some of the solar radiation on the planet. The reason being that our launch capability is exponentially increasing in leaps and bounds with the SpaceX projects, and they're heavy launch vehicles. And you could put I could envision spools of mylar sheeting, aluminized, being put into orbit to block a small fraction of the sunlight, to give us time to sort out the carbon cycle, to get the excess carbon. It's all about the carbon in the atmosphere, oceans. If you take it out of the ocean, then more CO2 from the atmosphere goes into the ocean, or vice versa. So if you take it out of either the atmosphere or ocean, it has the same effect. There's a lot of exchange of the gas between the two. We've just loaded up those systems with carbon from that used to be buried deep in the ground. So fundamentally, we need to take it out and get it back down. Iron is a nutrient in the ocean that's missing in a lot of regions. A lot of regions in the ocean are high nutrient, high nutrient, low iron. Okay, so iron is like the missing ingredient. If you put iron in, you get a proliferation of life. So we need to look at that, in a serious fashion. And also, there's this MIR project. They talk about using solar thermal devices to break down calcium carbonate from shellfish, and they produce calcium oxide plus CO2. You can capture the CO2 buried under the ground. You could use the calcium oxide powder and put it into the ocean, and it reacts with the carbonic acid, and it takes CO2 out of the ocean water, forming more calcium carbonate, which would then sink to the bottom. So that would sort of really address quickly the ocean acidification problem. The problem is the scale of all these things is enormous, right? The scale is enormous. But we can't just twiddle our thumbs and watch what's going to happen, because we're gonna have. I personally, I don't expect any of these ideas or things to happen probably until we have a global famine in say about 10 years, and then the world will maybe stand bolt upright and say, we have a crisis. How come we were never warned about this? And we can then take military budgets and look at how to go completely to renewable society, and how to remove CO2 from the atmosphere ocean system and to cool the planet. With military sized budgets, 700 billion from the US, for example, get all those scientists and engineers developing weapons and better ways and more efficient ways to kill people, and get them to this climate issue, this climate emergency problem, and other countries would follow suit. It might bring nations together in a sort of a collective fight for our survival on this planet. Because without that, we're going down. I don't think there's any argument. It's just how much time, what time is there, and we're kind of living on borrowed time right now. Most people are oblivious to what's really happening.
Well, I think most people really don't care enough, it seems to me.
They will when they can't eat, right?
Well, then already we've lost even more time. I think it's you're talking about, in a way, like the advantages of a small nuclear war. If you want disarmament, let's have a small war so everybody can see what it's like. It's not a good way to think, I don't think. You've got instead to think about what motivates people and what gets them moving. And we're not moving. We're talking about ideas, great ones here, but nobody's ready for this now, I don't think. In Canada, for one thing, it seems to me, are fixated on terrestrial permafrost. There's no real awareness of what's going on in the offshore. It seems to me we in Canada should be changing our way of thinking about all the stuff we're talking about today when it comes to methane. We should be going offshore rather more, but there's no readiness to do that. The people I talk to are really talking about dealing with the terrestrial permafrost, number one, and get on with that, which is right. We should do that. But the time urgent methane is going to come out of the shallow Arctic waters. I think it's not going to come out of land. How do we get people, my question then would be, to focus on what is most urgent, what is most doable, and to stop thinking about childcare and 1,000 other things that are uppermost to them. It's very hard to think. I'd say what we have to do is change the discourse, the way we talk about all this stuff. And I would also, therefore, suggest we need more input from the humanities and social sciences, as well as the exact sciences, which you guys represent.
Look, I've been waiting for somebody to use three magic words that I've come to put a lot of hope on: iron salt aerosols. And that takes care of that would address the Arctic sea ice and the clathrates melting. But when I mentioned it to Peter the first time, you said, if I'm not mistaken, it's premature to talk about that because we don't know enough. Well, because I am a social scientist and therefore panicky and totally unknowledgeable about real science, I actually did reach out to some people who are interested in iron salts aerosol. And I've got a program lined up on the 13th of May with two guys who are proponents of this and actually working. One guy has a company that is working on this. If any of you would like to join that conversation, I would particularly appreciate it.
I can join on the 13th. I know who your speakers are. I'm guessing anyway. Yeah. So there's a lot of interesting ideas on what to do, and in fact, Elon Musk has just announced a competition, or he did a while ago, 100 million to the best ideas to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So he's. I watched. I've been on a long drive in Northern Ontario, and I've had time to listen to podcasts. And Joe Rogan had interviews with Musk that one of them is over 3 hours long, and he certainly he's extremely concerned about climate change and the continuance of life and on our planet, and that's why if you look at all his businesses, the electric car, rockets, his idea is we've got to become a multi-planetary species in order to survive long term. He's very concerned about climate, and he's a great engineer. Imagine getting companies like SpaceX, working on carbon dioxide removal and on solar radiation management. Look at engineers and scientists in our world. How many are working on for the military? 50% of them. Like, this is what our world is like right now. And if you look at our universities, how many universities have a multidisciplinary department to look at world issues that threaten the lives of all of us? Like, for example, global famine in 10 years, or, abrupt climate change. How many universities have their earth scientists and their geographers and all of the different departments, a few people from each department, sociology, psychology, in a group, in sort of a climate emergency group or a climate group? Almost none. Okay, why not? I mean, the university system is pathetic for addressing real life problems. There's a great paper, and I talked about it a couple of videos back just last week. And one of the statements hit me, and it's Extinction. It's a British author. He said, Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg have done more to raise awareness of the climate emergency and the issues around climate change than 60 years of universities around the entire world. And that's a true statement.
It's true.
Right?
I think Turin, where I am at the moment, is going rapidly towards having such an integrated program. So they're gradually learning, but many of the students that I teach say, why do I have to learn all this from you? Because nobody's taught me any of this before. We need to learn this. We need to learn all about the overall global problems at university level or even at school level, and they don't. Usually they don't.
No, there's nothing. I mean, you go to high schools in Canada, you don't even learn anything about climate change. You might get. I asked my three sons have just gone through the system, and they say that maybe you get 2 or 3 hours in your entire high school career on climate change.
You don't get that on nuclear weapons. And when I was teaching for free a course on nuclear weapons, they made me stop because you're not allowed to teach for free anymore. But there's not another university, not another course at U of T, as far as I know, that has more than maybe one lecture on nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Am I wrong, Frank? Maybe you know. I haven't found any.
Yeah, I had one, but when I retired 20 years ago.
Me too.
Yeah.
I guess an example of where efforts are not being made and they should be is related to something Paul mentioned about the use of space sails to reflect energy. And there's a very good method of reflecting energy and that reducing global warming that nobody has funded putting it into effect. This is marine cloud brightening, which was developed ages ago. And the reason I mention it is because the person who invented it died last week.
Oh, geez, really? Okay.
John Latham.
Yeah.
What is it?
The idea is that it makes use of an effect that was discovered in the 1970s, that you pump seawater up a mast and get it high enough that it reaches to the base of clouds. That really means stratus clouds, marine clouds that are grey.
Just a kilometer. So yeah.
Yeah, the sort of, if through a very fine nozzle, and if the size of the nozzle is just right, then the little water particles evaporate to give you a salt particle of the right size. That gets into the cloud and brightens the cloud. If you have particles of a small enough size, they will make an aerosol brighter. It's called the Toomey effect. So it works, and it's been done, and it works perfectly well. And so the scientist who's really developed this into a workable system, in fact, he's an engineer, brilliant engineer called Stephen Salter, started out as a designer of wave power machines, and now he's developed this system, works it out exactly how to build the drone ships that would go around pumping up this water, looked at what it does to the cloud, the amount of cooling that you get, the fact that you can target the clouds or target the place you're aiming at so that it will actually have an effect on the ice. It will tend to make sea ice come back. All of that is just brilliant stuff and thought through completely. And yet the British government has never given him any money whatever to actually develop this, to actually try this out. And it doesn't even need development, it just needs building. So we see that this kind of hopeless feeling that even when solutions exist, they can't be implemented unless somebody puts some money in. But no government will, because you're dealing with governments which are completely useless, like the British government. And therefore you do need these very, very wealthy foundations, because they might be able to put in the money that will enable these solutions to be tried on a large enough scale to be a proper test.
We're up against the money and forces of the old established industries, the fossil fuel industries. A couple of weeks ago, I picked up the morning Ottawa Citizen, and the front page was all paid for ads on how renewable energies aren't going to go anywhere. It was called the Great Green Fraud or something. And how can we possibly compete against the fossil fuel industry and the public relations of them and other big industries that are wreaking havoc on the planet, right? I mean, I become fatalistic and say, okay, we have global food shortages coming in 10 years because of what we've done to our planet and environment, and let's see what happens then. And I'll do my bit. I'll put out my videos. I'll try to educate the public. But why should I have false hopes that a damn thing will be done? And a few years ago, I was a bit more idealistic. I thought, yes, let's do the three-legged bar stool, slash fossil fuel emissions, pull CO2 out of the atmosphere ocean system and cool the planet with solar radiation management, and all these ideas and stuff. But, years later, of course, there's no traction for any of these ideas, right? Our society, most people don't care, or they're unaware.
That's right.
So what's going to happen? So
how about us urging and wanting a better discussion between Indigenous people who live, especially in the Arctic? They live on the land, they're close to what's happening. It's not merely they have a stake in it, they are really connected in a way that we in the deep south of Canada are not. Is there not something we can learn from them if we try? It'll take time, but I think what we're discussing here is that we're going to lose time, and it's going to be hard to do things in time, but we got to do something now. And I wonder about sponsoring a discourse, a new way of talking between Southerners and high Northerners, and really talking about an Indigenous view of things, which we celebrate in name only. We don't practice much in this direction in Canada.
I mean, that's sort of the human condition, right? That we don't just throw up our hands. We've got to do something. I mean, I've talked to Catherine McKenna, the Minister of Infrastructure in Canada. She was the climate cabinet minister on climate and environment, but her new position is infrastructure. So she's got a lot of pull and a lot of sway, and she happens to be a neighbor of mine. And I bumped into her 3 times in the last few weeks. And every time I talk to her about I think there's a connection to the coronavirus right now. Okay. The coronavirus is an indoor disease. People get it indoors in public spaces, even if they're wearing masks. And the whole key is the ventilation of the indoor space. And if the ventilation is good, the risk is low. If the ventilation is poor, as most indoor public spaces are, the risk is high. So I tell her we need to install carbon dioxide monitors in every indoor public space. And when the CO2 level goes to about double the outside number, double the environmental number outside, which is double 400, so about 800 parts per million inside, an alarm goes off and people have to leave that public space, or windows have to be opened, and this would this would basically eliminate the virus. In my opinion, it would be as good as a vaccine. So I've been really trying to push this idea, and she's getting people looking at it. But the other thing is, if everybody in the public became aware of the CO2 level, the number, indoors and outdoors, and what it meant, and then saw it rising year after year, I think it would greatly raise awareness on climate change. It would also give us protection in society against any future pandemic. And we know with the destruction of rainforests and vegetation on land that disease vectors are taking off, and we'll have more and more pandemics everywhere. So the risks. So I've been trying to push something simple like that, and
I think all of you have produced one or more possible lines of approach, possible interventions, but I have no way of gauging how far each one of them would go. It would be really lovely if somebody, you'd have to be a big outfit to do it, to appraise how much we have to build one of these gadgets. They are either the thing in space, or the aerosols, or the iron in the ocean, or the brightening the clouds, or the various things that have been proposed. Any of them might go pretty far, but we need to know how long it would take to accomplish these, each one, and how much it would cost, and how big an operation it has to be, and how fast we have to do it. Because, we can talk about, well, we'd like to have a discourse, and frankly, I don't want to puncture your idea in particular. Of course, we want to have discourse with people in the Arctic, but that is a very slow process. And somebody sprinkling iron in the ocean, I believe that if all of us pitched in, we could buy enough iron to pay for half of the Atlantic Ocean. It's very cheap. We don't have the authority to do it, or the privilege, the right to we'd get in trouble. So there are various logistic problems. So people who come up with these really goofy, maybe wonderful ideas, they never go anywhere, because we don't actually get down to the engineering level of how to go about this. I'd say if everybody here came up with one proposal, famine, how are we going to prevent famine? How are we going to keep the acidification of the ocean from proceeding and so on? All of these things, they need to be looked at as an integrated set of real proposals. And I don't know how to make that happen, but I think that's what has to happen quickly.
Yes, quickness is the answer, because everything, we have so little time that we wasted so much time, and the effects are now getting very rapid. So we can only do, we can't do the things that we ought to be thinking about, communing with people and developing ideas about with Indigenous people and we've got, it would be great, but we haven't got time. We can only do the simple things that produce an immediate effect. We didn't do those back in 1992. There was the first assessment by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And if people had followed their recommendations, then we would only have had to do fairly mild things to get us to a better position than we're in now. We wouldn't have had to do drastic actions, but because we did nothing, there's only drastic actions left to us. That's all we've got left is drastic, apparently quite stupid things, but they're drastic because we haven't got time to take it slowly as we should have been able to do.
So we don't, I'm sorry, we don't have the motivation to act fast on the practical, perhaps doable things even. The motivation is hard to find. And I think at some level, again, we have to start talking about these matters in a different way. This conversation we've been having, I think, has been heavily reliant on technological fixes, one way or another. Is not technology part of the problem, our over-reliance that has brought us to where we are? Should we not be thinking and talking about that? And again, I'd go back to the Inuit or indigenous people and say, is there not something that's right there before us we're not seeing and not weaving into the way we attack these problems?
Hope there is, yes. I agree that using technology to cope with the effects of technology is a bit. It's like having a war to end wars. It's not a great idea, and usually doesn't work. But
it's Bill Gates' solution.
But we don't have much else.
Yeah. I have to agree with Peter. We don't have much else, and we don't have more time even right here on this program. So I want to thank you all very much for at least being alert and helping me to get more alert about these very important issues. Thank you so much. See you again.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.